Hi, my name is Sam Led, and welcome to The Fearless Now. This is for you in the nosebleed seats, if you're looking for an easier way to approach anxiety, stress, and unhealthy habits from the inside out. There's no techniques and no strategies, so sit back, relax, and let me be your peace of mind Uber driver, here on The Fearless Now. Welcome to the Fearless Now podcast. My name is Sam Led. I am a transformation coach. It is a pleasure to be here, and this is episode number 12. And in this episode, we're going to talk about using the power of feeling to determine the quality of your thinking. And this is really interesting because before I was introduced to the three principles that we've been talking about, the inside understanding that we are not our thinking, that the river of thought and thinking is just moving through us, that we don't have ownership over those thoughts. It's kind of being packaged up for us in a moment's notice by our supercomputer, doing its best to inform us of the world outside of us. But the package is filled with old stuff, old thought programs, conditioned thought, old traumas, old stories that we innocently sometimes get caught up in if we're not careful. And we all do it, including myself. Sometimes I have a PhD in getting caught up in my own thinking. And when we are caught up in uncomfortable feelings, constricted feelings, it's really hard to sometimes really see our cloudy thinking attached to really heavy, uncomfortable, anxious-ridden feeling as not true. And I remember as a little kid, my mother would say to me, she would walk into a room and she would be able to pick up the vibes of the room. She's very intuitive and she would feel it out and it wouldn't feel right. Something was wrong about that room. And I would walk into the room and it seemed fine to me. And so that's kind of the greatest metaphor for our quality of thinking in the moment when it's attached to uncomfortable feeling. Now, I loved woo, the big woo-woo. I'm intuitive in my own right, like a lot of you are. Like we all have the ability to be intuitive and tap into that place, that quiet place where our inner wisdom comes through. But our inner wisdom doesn't come through heavy, uncomfortable, anxiety-ridden feelings. It comes through that calm place, that quiet place. As Michael Neela, and I've repeated this many times in my episodes, it's that space before thought, that liminal space of quiet where all the answers come from. But we have this brain, this buggy supercomputer that loves you, that's doing its best to keep you safe. When I think of my own overwhelmed thinking attached to really uncomfortable, heavy, constricted feelings, sort of like thinking becomes this out of control locomotive that's going to run off the tracks. I realized in my own right, through my own experience of being human and also my experience of seeing my thinking, seeing my feelings attached to my thinking for what it is I'm just caught up in the machinery of my thinking. And attached to that heavy, overwhelmed thinking is my suffering and the feelings that I'm experiencing. We all do it. And then the ego comes in and then labels and judges and tries to make you see that, hey, this thinking is real. This is real. It's trying to convince you that whoever is hurting your feelings or whoever is being judgmental towards you, they're a threat and you need to do something about it when they're just caught up in their own thinking at the time, that it's innocent. And I want to give you a great example. And this is the story that I've shared with some friends about early COVID when we were in our first lockdown here in California. I really missed my family, really missed my parents. I haven't seen them in over a year because of this pandemic, because I don't want to get them sick. But in the early days of the lockdown, the first lockdown we had, my mind was questioning this whole thing. It was weaving all these conspiracy theories that the mass media is telling us a big lie and that the numbers of COVID cases are exponentially overreported and it's not what we think it is. And like a lot of us, it's very human to question authority, to question the media and what we're being fed in social media. But my quality of thinking and how I felt attached to that was really, really heavy and really uncomfortable. And I remember talking to my sister and to my parents when my sister was going to drive to visit my parents in Florida. They live up in the Northeast, so it's doable. From here in California, it's a long trip. And they were going to do it. And I was stuck here, haven't seen my family in a long time. And what came out of my mouth to try to convince them that it was okay for me to travel, this is before we knew, how really serious this pandemic was in the early days of the lockdown. I said, air travel's safe. And I was throwing all these links to studies and getting really offended when my family didn't want me to come visit them because for obvious reasons. But I didn't see it that way because my thinking was really clouded, was caught up in a story. I was offended. I thought that they'd rather see my sister and her kids and her family more, that they weren't willing to let me self-quarantine, that I was in the way, and all this crap, all this insecure thinking. And it was attached to really devastatingly anxious and constricted and heartbreaking type of feelings that my family just didn't want to see me, not because of the pandemic, because I wasn't responsible enough to quarantine, or that I wouldn't do the right thing and isolate myself before I came to visit. They didn't trust that I would be able to do that and keep them safe, which was completely wrong and completely silly. It was my thinking that was getting me into trouble. It was my feelings attached to that runaway train of nonsense that was getting me in trouble. Now, fast forward now, believing my mind, trying to convince me that they just didn't want to see me because they didn't think I was responsible enough to do the right thing and self-quarantine. It's completely nonsense, that I was just caught up in foggy thinking. And I couldn't see the forest from the trees. My family loves me and they care for me deeply and they want to see me. I just couldn't see clearly out of my cognitive windshield because it was all fogged up with heavy nonsense thought, that I was believing the story my brain was telling me, that this is the truth. And my ego was getting bruised because it was saying, well, they just don't really want to see you and they don't want to take a chance because they don't think that you would be responsible enough to take care of what needs to be taken care of, and self-isolating and making sure that I was really being cognizant of being careful of not being around people for 14 days before seeing them, which was all nonsense, which was completely false. And like all of our brains are brilliant, but it's an operating system preloaded with all kinds of programs. Some of them are great. Some of them are helpful. Some of them get us to where we want to go in life. A lot of the programs are old, outdated, corrupted by trauma and by letdowns and by failure and by fill in the blank. But until we allow our minds to correct on its own, until we let thoughts settle, we're still caught up in the machinery of our thinking. We're still driving around in a car with a dirty or fogged up windshield, and we forget to turn the windshield wipers on, and we're just driving around blind. And that's kind of what happens when we get caught up in the moment of our heavy thinking, attached to heavy feelings. I thought it was the opposite, that we have these moments of dread, or we have these moments of real, I'm not talking about then there's an imminent danger, a real imminent danger, like there's a saber-toothed tiger looking at us and we're feeling dread and we're feeling that adrenaline rush, that fight or flight. I'm talking about regular everyday stuff and how we can get caught up and wrapped up in our own stuff that in the moment really skews our perception. And then the brain creates all kinds of scenarios to convince us that the story that it's cooking up is gospel, is real. Kind of the moral of this episode, the moral of this story, the moral of, and the brilliance of the three principles is it teaches us that our quality of thinking is a true barometer when it's connected to really heavy, uncomfortable feelings. That it's not there to try to punish us or to make us feel sick or to make us just have a miserable couple of hours of feeling out of control and overwhelmed and depressed and anxious. It's telling us that at that current moment, we just got some real heavy thought turbulence moving through us that we have no ownership of. Just like a pilot flying a plane, and think of you as the plane, navigating around some heavy weather, some heavy turbulence. It can come out of nowhere. There's clear air turbulence. That's kind of like our thinking. That once we see that the quality of our thinking is really everything, and that at any moment we can see that when we are feeling really uncomfortable or feeling really down or feeling really overwhelmed, connected to a whole big bunch of nonsense thinking and a narrative that our brain is cooking up to label what's going on in the world outside of us. Like, oh my God, I just lost my job. I don't know how I'm going to make it next month, pay my rent. I'm hopeless and doomed to survive and keep a roof over my head. And all that story that a lot of us are experiencing now during this pandemic. When that kind of thinking is really seen for what it is, and you just sit with it and let it settle and get real quiet, you're really able to see that it's just an old story being cooked up, connected to some really uncomfortable feeling, and that it will settle, and that you're going to be okay. That who you are is not any of that heavy thought turbulence or foggy thinking. that the brain's just going to jump around because it's trying to keep you safe. It's trying to inform you of the outside world through a perceptual lens that can be clouded by some heavy thought turbulence that we, whether consciously or subconsciously, or we're not even aware of, is just moving through us. And it's such a gift. It really is. It's uncomfortable. It's scary sometimes, especially for some of us, including myself, that have really battled anxiety and panic and that kind of stuff over the years. But once you see that, kind of like when a pitcher gets hit with a fastball and they just try to walk it off and they're in a lot of pain, but 10 minutes later, that pitcher is feeling better and the audience applauds because he walks to first base and, he's okay. That's the same thing with those feelings that are so overwhelming and you're thinking that's really convincing, that's convincing you that it's true. And when you see that, there's such freedom in that it's not the world outside of us that's dangerous. Yes, of course, if you see a saber-toothed tiger growling at you, you probably don't want to stick around. Or if you're walking a dark alley and there's a guy holding a knife, you probably don't want to stick around. But through day-to-day life, when we see that world outside of us as scary and our day-to-day experiences are overwhelming because of what's going on in the world right now in the pandemic, you got to question the quality of your thinking in that moment. Because there are billions of other people that are successful in the midst of a pandemic. There are billions of other people that are having children, that are buying houses, that are getting new jobs, that are writing books, that are creating their next step in their life amidst their cloudy thinking, being caught up in their suffering of their heavy thoughts and their overwhelming feelings. If you can just see and just sit with those heavy feelings and know that they will pass and that you're on to fresh thinking in the next 10 minutes, next 15 minutes, you'll see that it's all made up in the moment, that you don't have any agency or control over it. And when you see that heavy thinking and those horrible feelings in the moment is the ultimate barometer. It's saying, don't believe me. You're just flying through some heavy thought turbulence. You'll be able to see the forest from the trees. You'll be able to see when it calms down and when to act and when to take control of your life and when to make those decisions. I hope this has been helpful. It is an honor and a privilege to be here. This podcast is made possible because of people like you. And the more people you tell your friends, and they tell their friends, and then they tell their friends, their cousins, their pets, their priests, their rabbis, this podcast will flourish because this podcast is for all of you, for you, and you in the nosebleed seats. These episodes aren't free. I have to pay someone to edit them and to make these episodes sound great. So the more people you tell, more people that can like and subscribe and comment on this podcast, the more successful this will be and the more episodes I can share with you and the insight and wisdom of the 3 principles. And it's just so great to be here for all of you. Have a great week, everybody, and I'll see you again for episode number 13 of The Fearless Now.